Okay, we are live, and hi everyone. I'm Carrie Cassidy from Project Camelot, and very happy to be here today. So I have Patrick Riley with me, and he was on my show actually about a week, maybe a week and a half ago. And so, Patrick, it's great to have you back. We agreed back then to talk about the Secret Space program. And I think you've got some knowledge in this area. And as a I don't know if you call yourself a free energy inventor or what you call yourself, but but maybe you can give yourself, for those that don't know you already and haven't seen my prior interview with you, but I highly recommend that. Give yourself a short introduction, and then let's just get into this topic.
Sure. So I have a background in the military, about 16 and a half years. I'm a acquired savant and inventor with quite a few new businesses on XRP Ledger. And I'm also, with my inventions and my background, I'm a acquired savant who basically I'm able to put together large pictures or large sets of data into conclusions that not many people can see or draw from those sets of data. So I'm able to see things in a very different way, and I think it's given me some insight into this topic. And I don't know how much of what I have to say today is going to be new to everyone, but I hope it's informative.
Okay, fair enough. And you have a number of inventions, and all those are discussed in our prior interview. So we're not going to go back over that. But just let me say that, you're quite obviously brilliant in this area of, free energy or 0 point energy or whatever. And that it gives you kind of a unique perspective because as an inventor, as a sort of a group that has been heavily redacted, if you will, and also even people have been killed over this. One of our witnesses, Brian O'Leary, was given a fast acting cancer, believed himself to have had many sort of I don't know, murder attempts, whatever, and then did die, and so on. So there are others, obviously, maybe some very famous ones that I'm not even thinking of this minute. But I've interviewed lots of people over the years in that area of 0 point energy inventors and so on. So can you tell us, how did you be, because I also was struck when we first talked by your ability to not only be an inventor, but also to have a public understanding and sort of as a businessman on the one hand, also understanding that there is secrecy out there that is preventing you and others like you from bringing your inventions to the public. And so you seem to have handled that quite well, in a balanced fashion, and you're still alive.
I,
and
I have.
yeah. And so why don't you talk about that? Talk about how you maybe met up with the opposition to these ideas getting disseminated into the public.
Yeah, so the way that I handled it is I've used blockchain and what's called NFTs or non-fungible tokens on the blockchains. And I minted my designs to more than a dozen different blockchains. And what that does is it makes it so that they're publicly available and can be viewed by anybody with the wallet address that wants to go and look at them. And of course, Carrie has the link. I'm sure she's going to add it to the description here. But with that, they can never actually be taken down unless the government was to take down the entire blockchain, the entire support network for Ethereum, for SHA-256, for the XRP Ledger, and many others. So I've made it very difficult for the government to intercede and erase those from the public library, as it were. But just as importantly, I did not apply for patents and I did not pursue patents. If I were to apply for a patent, I am asking the government's permission to put out what is my intellectual property. And then because I have asked them for permission, the 1951 Patent Secrecy Act would give the government the ability to put me under a no comment, or basically I would be unable to speak. I'd be under a gag order about my own inventions. And if I did speak, I'd be committing something tantamount to treason or espionage by speaking about my own ideas. So the government has the ability to stamp it with a national secrecy act and national security concerns and say, this will be buried, you'll never see it again. And that's that. So because I haven't asked their permission and I've made it public and available and I've given it away to anyone that wants to go and view it and do it themselves, they have no legal recourse to come after me. I've also not admitted publicly to having built these. And so if there is no physical device that has been built according to their knowledge, they do not have cause for a warrant to come and look for one to claim some device and say this was dangerous. So as long as I am just putting out an idea and I haven't asked their permission to put out that idea, there's nothing they can legally do about it. Now, of course, they could still kill me. They could still come after me in other ways, but I do have dead drops and things of that nature that would become even more problematic for them. And I don't necessarily think the government wants to draw attention to me by giving me that much credibility by killing me. And I, of course, have a social media presence and quite a few people in my companies that would take it some kind of way if they did.
Okay. All right. That's an interesting approach. Now, in terms of, you say you haven't spoken about it. So, well, you spoke at a conference and you came on my show,
Well,
but you don't consider that speaking about it?
no, so I've spoken about it publicly, but I haven't requested their permission in any ways. Maybe I misspoke in my response there.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. So I think there's validity there. I'm sure it sounds like you've investigated the law, right, in that regard.
Yes, I did.
Okay, and I'm actually getting, as we speak, a copy of our prior interview, so people can have that handy. But it is on my website, and you can just do a search. There's a search bar when you get to my website, projectcamelotportal.com, and you can post in. You can actually post his, type his first or last name, and then you'll get the interview coming up. And so now I have to just get some windows out of the way so I can post this here. So just one second. I want to do that for people. Okay, so that's in the chat. And then on that page, we have many links to Patrick's work as well. So as we talk here, you can click on those and follow along. Anyway, so all right. So have you known, I think a lot of you guys kind of hang out together or know each other and so and so. So can you say that, whether that's the case? And I just want to throw out a few people that I've dealt with, like John Bedini. Have you heard of him?
I have not. And to be honest, I don't have a lot of contacts in any kind of community as far as inventors or scientists. I'm like siloed. Up until I got out of the military, my typical missions or my typical lifestyle was me and 1 to 2 other operators out on a mission for months at a time, and I spent maybe 3 or 4 days stateside for many different months between deployments. So that was kind of my life. So I'm not connected in that way to the energy community.
Okay. Do you know who John Hutchinson is?
I do not.
Wow. Okay. So, well, it might behoove you to look these people up. And there are some others. And George Green, of course, he's not alive anymore, but I did interview a man named George Green he showed a little motor kind of thing in one little video and stuff like that. So anyway, did you know who Brian O'Leary was at all?
I did not.
He's a former Mars astronaut who he was slated to go to Mars, and then they wrapped that. They say they wrapped that program, but that was through NASA. And he also was a professor at MIT for many years. And they tried to clear his record and pretend he never existed. He had attempts on his life, as I have said. And then what he did, he also wrote some books where he went around the world interviewing free energy activists and inventors. So his book would be very interesting for you to read, probably. But so there, and there are, it's been growing. I mean, it's a huge area now, and I think that, we have tons of stuff out there. But you're extremely organized and extremely well thought out. Let me say that much. And your so-called inventions and so on, or whatever you want to call them, are they're pictured on your interview with me and on your website and so on and so forth, so people can get into that. All right. So from there, you kind of sound like you went down a rabbit hole, and also having a military background, and you were something of you were kind of in intelligence in the military, as I recall, right?
So psychological operations and civil affairs. So it's very similar to Intel, or kind of a subset that's a sister job to Intel, if you will, but not specifically intelligence.
All right. So, but having been in the military and being familiar maybe with their operations and stuff, did you also bounce up against CIA and various other intel agencies during your time, even in the military?
Consistently. And I was consistently accused of being CIA. Unfortunately, everyone overseas thinks you're either CIA or UN. So it was a constant insult.
Okay. All right. And so at some point, what kind of circumstances brought you more in the know about secret space and our hidden space program, and maybe the hidden programs in other countries as well?
Yeah, so when I joined the B-51st KCOM, I was attached to them as a combat medic, and they kind of realized very quickly I was good at being very persuasive, and I was good at speaking to high-level dignitaries, or generals or heads of state and things like that. And they started to realize I was a little bit maybe above average intelligence, slightly. So they started to make use of me in the ways that the commanders of those units wanted to. So I ended up interacting with people at levels that I was privy to certain information that would have otherwise been well above my pay grade and well above my security clearance. And some of them spoke very freely about these things in ways that I don't think I am authorized to speak about. Now, I will preface this by saying I of course have signed a SF Form 312, which gives me about 20 years after I retired in December 2022 before I would be able to speak about anything in a classified nature. And of course, I know some things are classified, but nonetheless, I've been able to extrapolate and understand kind of a larger picture of the operations of what civilians generally call the secret space program. And I think I have a pretty good idea of where that lives within our government and how that works.
Okay, so are you familiar with, number one, underground bases and bases across the United States, if not the world, where a lot of this technology exists and is in use? And then on the other hand, are you also aware of, in the governmental way, this, what they call unacknowledged special access programs?
Yes, very much aware of the deep underground military bases, and there's more than 10,000 deep underground military bases worldwide. We spent more than $1.5 billion training 32 BCTs to do subterranean warfare in 2017, 2018. So I have participated in some of that training. I've been in other underground facilities at various different times for various different reasons. And I'm well aware that we have technology that is above and beyond the scope of what is publicly known.
Okay. And as far as unacknowledged special access programs, specifically, have you dealt with, for example, because a lot of it is wrapped into aerospace, the aerospace companies, the very well-known players, and then also Congress and certain members of Congress.
So most of that is a misdirect, and that's kind of why I was happy to do this interview, because that's not where the majority of this would live. Most of it lives within the private sector, and I'm gonna throw around a couple of names of agencies and companies that people probably haven't heard a lot about. And I hope that doesn't get me in too much trouble, but there are certain companies that I think explains a bigger picture going on of how the private sector is actually running the SSP under specific cartels, if you will, or cabals, if you will, that goes back to the early 1900s and the robber barons. And it really all connects through Operation Paperclip and Gladio and the underground black money funding through the drug trade.
Sure, absolutely, and human trafficking and so on, uh,
Exactly.
and guns, the three usual suspects. But when okay, so when you're going to name some companies, obviously, and I've dealt with some companies. Okay, and actually, in the real world, I was working for at least one company like that. Uh, Not, I didn't sign any oaths or anything. I just was there on a temporary basis as an executive assistant back many years ago, but nonetheless. So when you're talking about the private sector and you're talking about, are you aware, for example, of Truman and MJ12 and some of those ins and outs?
I am aware of most of those ins and outs as far as the history of that, but it goes into so there's not a good starting point for this, but if we were to back it up to Allen Dulles and the Harriman brothers and the Rockefellers and
Sure.
Rothschild Bank and all of that, that would probably be the best starting point in the late 1800s. Of course, we know that the Council of Foreign Relations, formed under those same groups, was what would later become the SSO and then the CIA. At the same time, you had the Fords and Prescott Bush and this Allen Dulles and Harriman, Rothschilds, Rockefellers were all the primary bankers and funders of the Nazi Party. Of course, the Nazi Party's first headquarters was 39 Broadway in Manhattan back in 1932, under Union Pacific Bank, which was Prescott Bush, Herbert Walker, and I'm forgetting the third guy's name right now, but that money all effectively funded World War II and the Nazi Party, which then was the same money that funded the CIA and Operation Paperclip. Now, of course, all of the space program, the secret space program, really started under Germany in World War II. We know all of the development under Werner von Braun, all the development that happened into the V2 and various other flying crafts that were appearing during that time using primarily Nikola Tesla research. And then, we had basically Operation Paperclip was a rescue operation for high value scientists, high value individuals that were contributing to this cabal of financiers. It wasn't so much anything to do with politics or government or racism or any of those low level scare tactics of what we're taught in history. So as they brought them over, they were also, of course, the Rothschilds founded Israel. We know all about the Balfour Declaration. We know about the transfer agreement in 1933 signed by Adolf Hitler, et cetera, et cetera. So between Mossad, between Germany, between the CIA, between these Rothschild Rockefellers and the Council on Foreign Relations, this was all basically one organization of financiers exercising their influence, and also on the mafia, and Luciano throughout World War II and after. The same group of people that would go on to assassinate Kennedy and etc.
Okay, and are you familiar with, for example, the role that James Jesus Angleton played in that
And
group? Oh, you're not.
no,
Okay, well, may I suggest
absolutely.
in your studies that you do a great deal of research into him, because he was instrumental during the war and after the war in also paperclip and dealing with the Dulles brothers and so on in his own way. So, and then he kept the secrets at CIA going long after that. And in fact, we ran up against a brick wall to do with him early in our sort of investigations. Um, I think I'm at liberty to say that we received death threats along those lines. So that is a highly sensitive area, and so just want to give you one name. So okay, great, because you obviously have a great background to delve into all this. So what I'd like to do is let you run with it. I won't ask you any more questions. I'm going to just let you sort of lay it out as you understand it. And then eventually I'll try to be quiet because
Sure,
it's
sure.
hard for me to stop asking questions, but
No,
I'll do it and I want you to, just deliver it the way you would almost a presentation to my audience.
yeah, and I don't mind if you interject at all, so feel free. And as I mentioned before, I certainly don't know everything in this topic, and nor does anybody that would ever speak about it. Um, but I will say I think I've connected a few of the ins and outs of the how and the who and the where. So as we had this Operation Paperclip back in 1946, bringing the Nazi high level command and high level scientists over into this CIA and giving them autonomy, authority without accountability. Um, that same group of people, of course, went into things like MK Ultra, and we had various studies that went directly against human condition and were crimes against humanity. Um, Throughout that, they started to understand that from their perspective, the best way to keep anything secret, and this was, of course, McCarthyism years, where everyone was a communist, and they were afraid of the communists because the Bolsheviks killed half of the royal family in Russia when they took out the czars, and that same royal family and the Rothschilds and the robber barons were all basically the elite, and they were afraid of the common people, the communists, and they were afraid of that idea catching on across the West. So the McCarthyism mentality was that to keep a secret, they would have to compromise people in ways that would be unrecoverable. So it started really with things like the Playboy Mansion, and you had the tunnels under the Playboy Mansion to the Getty Museum that's 3 miles away. Things of that nature. Getty himself, I suspect, was in fact John Paul Getty was Joseph P. Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, who, if you look into it, came out of nowhere as the richest man in America with a royal fortune that more than likely came from the gold confiscated from families, or wealth confiscated from families during the Holocaust. But as that evolved over time, that went from compromising, politicians and stars in the way of having damaging evidence that they were sleeping with minors. So they would start with an older crowd when they were initially at the Playboy Mansion, and they would work their way down. And then, it can start with, oh, you're just committing adultery, but then adultery wasn't enough. They needed something more concrete. So it went to minors. And then eventually, as it graduated through the intense use of black money with drugs, and use of cartels, use of the mafia, and kind of the integration of the mafia and the cartel with the CIA into being one organization, the tactics used to secure their secrets became much more brutal and much more unsavory. So eventually it got to the point where, in order to be privy to state secrets that were considered of the highest level of regard, anything above top secret, you basically had to rape and murder a child. That was effectively the end point of that road, was that the Epstein Island eventuality. So now when we look at things like Epstein Island today, what we see is, of course, the visitors that we do know. We know about Marvin Minsky. We know about Stephen Hawking, who was, of course, not very capable of certain other things, but Joschka Bach, Lawrence Krauss, George Church, Robert Trivers. These were all high-level scientists being pulled in and exposed and compromised at Epstein Island. Of course, you also had famous people and you had politicians. So now why specifically these people beyond just their power and their influence? The key is the scientists, right? So if you're going to keep state secrets or you're going to keep a really, really big secret, you're going to need something extremely damaging that is unrecoverable from it. And so the key to all this is a guy by the name of Robert Mercer, who runs Renaissance Technologies, or did run Renaissance Technology, who is deeply connected to Epstein. Epstein also connected to MIT laboratories and multiple different forms of genetic research. Of course, there's all that kind of stuff that went on, as well as Terramar. But when you start looking into Renaissance Technologies, you'll quickly realize that its growth of more than 30% year over year from its founding is completely untenable and unrealistic. And Renaissance Technologies CEO Robert Mercer came from an organization prior to that called IDA, IDA.gov. And if you look at it, you'll see it's very understated and very unadvertised. But the Institute for Defense Analysis employs thousands of high-level physicists and scientists and basically everything you would need to build a secret space program. And they support what's called federally funded research companies, or FFRDCs. So FFRCs, excuse me. So the FFRCs, you have, let me find this. So you've got things like Rand Corporation out there, or you've got the American Institute for Research. You've got law firms like Allen and Clark, National Conference of State Legislators. That sounds official, just like Federal Reserve. It's not federal. You've got Whiteboard Advisors, MITRE, the Aerospace Corporation, MIT Lincoln Laboratories, Sci-Fi Works, Peoria Robotics Handling Incorporated, which of course works with DARPA, as many of these do, and the Rand Arroyo Center. So now when you start looking into the people that Epstein was basically ensnaring, and you start comparing them to the people associated to IDA and the FFRCs coming out of IDA, you start to see a picture where there's very clearly something being technologically developed within our government by some very, very capable scientists who had to be compromised in order to work in those positions. So that is kind of my 40,000-foot view of where the secret space program likely lives within our government, is within these civilian-run private companies that are federally funded research companies working under a government agency called IDA that is effectively invisible. I don't think I've ever heard anyone else actually talk about them. And that is all working under a umbrella of Renaissance Technologies.
Okay, that's great. Now, you appear to have some slides. Do you want to share them? If you want to, you can. If you don't, that's fine.
So I just have kind of notes, actually. It's
all right.
not slides, sorry. I wish I had a better visual, but it would still all be type.
Okay, so are you familiar with the sort of secrecy surrounding the atom bomb? That whole development that happened that I think dovetails into what you're talking about.
Yeah, and with the Manhattan Project, I mean, there was 130,000 people working on the Manhattan Project, and for the most part, 95% of them had no idea what they were working on, and that very few that actually did know were kept under very close watch, lock and key, and they shipped them all out to New Mexico and put them on basically a uh, a isolated base and an isolation. I'm forgetting the name right now of the base in New Mexico. Should be on the
Los Alamos.
there we go. Thank you. It's on the tip of my tongue. So Los Alamos was, completely built around the Manhattan Project. And of course, the evolution of that over time was to start to build out DUMBs or deep underground military bases where things could be even more isolated to get people into those deep underground military bases, as well as into what I strongly suspect are our ships in the solar system and possibly beyond. You would need to make people effectively disappear, and you would have to have breeding programs that are separate from mainstream humanity, because you don't want anyone to have any ties to regular people out there in the normal world. So you'd want to basically make a breakaway society with intent. And I do suspect that, the 800,000 children that go missing every year, some of them are certainly trafficked, some of them are certainly killed for various purposes. But I also suspect many of them are being sent either into specific bases to be raised in a militaristic society where they're completely compliant with whatever job they're being purposed for, or they're being sent off world to places where we are effectively expanding our footprint. And I will say that as far as there was a gentleman, and I'm sure you know his name. I'm really bad at recalling these things off the top of my head, but the gentleman who hacked NASA and found a list of
Barry McKinnon.
Yep, there we
who
go.
I interviewed, yes.
Yep, and he found the list of extraterrestrial officers and a list of 10 ships. Now, I do take that list as being legitimate, and among those ships was listed the Curtis LeMay, or the USSS LeMay, which I found very interesting as his proximity to members of Paperclip, as well as the Hillenkotter, which is very interesting as he was one of the first founding directors of the OSS, which would become the CIA. So I think it's very telling about where that actually is. And then we have NASA, which of course was Werner von Braun, and we had multiple other Paperclip members participating in NASA. There's pictures of them sitting with President JFK back in the day and, discussing things business as usual. It's also a very interesting point that NASA is the largest procurer of helium in the world. Now, I know the flat Earth crowd would love to say that's because, they're putting satellites up there on balloons. That's all fine. And if you believe that, I did a flat Earth debate with Wix It, Fix It a while ago, if you want to know where I stand on that. But it's more likely that these things were being done at scale as early as the 60s. Under Curtis LeMay, there were different plans that David Adair talked about, in which basically if you do submarines, which are already living in an alien environment using nuclear power, which at that time everything was nuclear powered, and if you put a submarine out into the ocean, where no eyes are on it, and you were able to lift that with enough helium and boost it into orbit, you would be able to then achieve a space-based platform that is many times greater than anything that is publicly acknowledged. Now, I do think most of what NASA puts out these days is very much fake. But I think that's because it is the front, the cover up to make it look like we haven't made it very far, when in reality, we could have had space-based destroyers or space-based platforms that are quite sizable as early as the 1950s, 1960s.
Right. And that I assume you know about William Tompkins and his work, right?
I do not.
Oh, no. Okay. That's another name you should definitely. But I have a 3-hour interview with him. So he was one of the people that designed those ships. And we have a short documentary we're going to be releasing soon, because we went to visit a museum where a lot of his early as a kid, he was discovered by the secret space program because of his designs of ships. Okay, I mean ships in the sea. And then he went on to design these vehicles that we believe John Leonard Walson has photographed near the sun and so on, and they're his designs basically. So showing us the the wide range that our secret space program has been involved. Do you know anything about the Pleiadians, the reptilians, their involvement, and then also, of course, the involvement of the beings from Aldebaran with, Maria Orsich and the whole Nazi Bell and all of that stuff. Did you follow that trail?
So I have gone down those rabbit holes a little bit, but I'll say that the reason I did is because I did have an experience while on a mission. I didn't specifically see an extraterrestrial or anything of that nature, but I saw something that was bizarre enough in its level of technology that I did not believe we could have created it, even with other things I had seen on Earth. And effectively what it was a mask of a world leader. And on the backside of that mask appeared to be the indents of reptilian or scale type of skin. And this mask was alive, and it appeared to have some sort of technological abilities, and it was warm to the touch, and it was not being worn by a person at the time. So I took it as quite bizarre. It's one of those things that you see and you're just like, well, I don't know who I would even report this to. I don't know what I would do with this information. I don't like, so, it was very, very surreal, I guess, in the moment. And I really still don't know what I'm supposed to do with that information, but it was certainly something that I could say was beyond the cusp of the norm. So I started looking into those types of things, and I can't say I found anything I would consider conclusive, but do I think that there's alien life, and do I think that the Pleiadians and reptilians and other species that are commonly talked about are real species? Absolutely. I would, from a skeptical standpoint, I would say there has not been a place on Earth or on the moon or any other place in our known science that we have traveled or tested that we found inhospitable to life, whether that's tardigrades in space or bacteria in geysers under the Mariana Trench or bacteria on moon rocks or Martian rocks. We haven't found anywhere that doesn't support life. So the idea that space is a vacuum, I think, is very much nonsensical. It's more of an ocean, and it's teeming with life.
Excellent. Yes. Well, okay. So there's a lot of different directions. Where do you want to go from here? Because and can I just ask you what year, approximate year, did you come across this sort of mask that jogged your mind in such a way?
So that was 2019, so very recently.
Oh,
And that was a very bizarre experience. And I, of course, don't want to give away who showed that, because they were showing it as effectively a whistleblower to me because they were paid for their lives. So I don't necessarily want to give more details on that because I
that's
don't think
fine.
there's anything I could do to a person. But yeah, that it was very bizarre.
Okay. But as I say, now there is another element that gets involved here, and I don't know whether you go down that road, but I have to ask anyway. So time travel is heavily involved in the secret space program. Many people don't realize that. So that's a piece. Now, have you investigated that side of things?
I have looked into Operation Looking Glass. I am familiar with the Groom Lake facility and different levels within S4 and things of that nature. I will say that my own development of technology and my own inventions, which have been largely and almost completely independent of anything anyone else has done. They've basically been invented in a silo. What I'm able to create and what I know I'm able to do tells me that the United States government and during the early 1900s, late 1800s, would have had capabilities far beyond anything that we're seeing publicly right now. I'm saying over 100 years ago, we had capabilities to do things that people can't even imagine today. So I have zero doubt in that because I know although I do think I'm generally smart, I don't think that I'm the smartest person on the planet, and I don't think I'm smarter than all the scientists the United States government can muster. I'm certain they're probably well beyond anything that I've developed to date. So when I talked in our last interview about phase 12 and the ability to communicate consciousness across time and space, and potentially communicate from the future to the past, or even to record the past in a four-dimensional Google Earth, I think those are things that our government's probably thought of since long before I was born.
Right. Okay. So I am very interested though to know, and I don't know how you would describe this, but you know, most of the time when people get into certain areas of investigation, they get very attracted by a certain part of this rabbit hole, so to speak.
Yeah.
So can you talk about where you think your most investigation has taken place and maybe your favorite area or something like that?
So I'm more or less interested in the business side of it, and maybe I'm just a dry kind of guy, but I'm very interested in how it functions from an actual business day-to-day operations. How are they doing supplies? How are they keeping oxygen up there? How are they, getting people back and forth? Are they shuttling people back and forth, or are people there for the long term? Things like this interest me, and it interests me on a logistical perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And it's partly selfishly because I want to launch something I've affectionately named Ascension Point. Ascension Point is part of one of my companies, Ascension Mint, where we're planning on going to space to mine asteroids and in the main belt. And I think it certainly can be done. And actually, I have a video to share. And the reason I want to share this isn't to promote the company. I want to share this to show how simple and easy the math and the capabilities are to do this, and why what I'm looking at doing in the next 10 to 20 years as a individual entrepreneur is something that our government probably figured out 100 years ago. And I think that will put things in a little bit of a perspective.
Okay. Can I ask you, what part of the United States do you live in again?
I'm in Texas.
Okay. Now, have you had any exposure to Colorado, and especially Colorado Springs, where a lot of this kind of stuff enters, I think, into what you're interested in, or sound like you're interested, at least the business side. And then there's also SAP. You're familiar with SAP?
Special access programs. I'm familiar
Not,
with.
no, it's maybe I'm saying it wrong. There's a, I don't know how to describe it. Maybe I got the name wrong. Anyway, it's a network. It started out as a small integral, where supply companies supply each other with supplies, right? So it keeps track of everything, right? From a hammer to a, spacecraft. It's a gigantic database. Are you familiar with that? I'm probably not calling it by the right name.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that, but I would be very interested to analyze that and throw it through
Right.
my AI.
It has a public face. That's why I'm trying to say. And I have to go back and remember the name of it. It starts with, at least has some of those letters in it, I think. Anyway, I just was curious. Okay, go ahead.
So So this is my design. Can you see that just fine?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So this is a 600-meter diameter facility to build what would essentially be a 500-meter diameter with 250-meter void in the center space station called Ascension Point. And the reason it's built to this scale is because the scale is what makes it possible to lift this thing. So helium being about 11.68 kilograms of lift per cubic meter. If you go to enough size that you're able to contain enough volume, you're able to lift something very large as opposed to using purely rocketry to lift something off the ground. Now, the biggest problem we have with, ordinary rockets historically is always the cost per kilogram to orbit. So cost per kilogram to orbit for Elon Musk, even though he's brought down that price significantly, is still around $10,000 per kilogram. So the way that I've designed it here, we're able to lift this craft, this basically space station, as a single piece up to roughly 40,000 feet based on the calculations, and it can weigh about 50,000 tons. So it can be considerably heavy, and then we can use rockets or thrusters or something similar to my ionic circuit drive to push it from there into something like the Lagrange point where it would maintain an orbit. So now the rest of this video is pretty to watch and all that, but I don't know that it's as relevant. But essentially, this is what our government has most likely been doing, and this is why NASA is the largest procurer of helium, and the Air Force is a very large procurer of helium, because if we were to put something into space, it's in an alien environment, so it's going to be something similar to the submarine core, right? So it's already going to be a self-contained apparatus, and then you're going to need to lift it in this way with some sort of balloon shape. And this also explains why many of the ships that are reported, such as the Hillenkotter and the LeMay, are submarine shaped or cigar shaped in nature, and that cylindrical body gives an advantage when it comes to things like anti-gravity. So just looking at it from a perspective of my screen sharing thing likes to show up on the monitor behind me. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing. But from the perspective of scientific application, it makes the most sense that our government was doing this back in the 60s or 70s. And that's likely why many of our naval ships have double designations, where you'll actually see they'll produce basically two ships with the exact same designation, and one is just kind of off the books. And that's basically what we've seen here. So the strategic systems program within the Navy, or ssp.navy.mil, is likely where the secret space program designation or term came from. And you'll also find that that's where Salvatore Pais was working for the Navy and inventing and patenting many different things, such as the TR-3B Astra's propulsion technology.
Okay, so are you familiar with things like the TR-3B and the other subsequent, craft?
I'm familiar with the mechanical underpinnings and what would need to happen within that craft for it to function.
Okay, so in light of your sort of area of knowledge and expertise, and in a sense, you're sort of like, I think you're kind of a builder designer as well, right? So why is it that the secret space program hasn't approached you, to get you to join?
Yeah, I honestly I think that the majority of what I was doing while I was in the military probably made me a little bit unapproachable, in that they didn't trust me and they thought that I was a bit of a maverick. I do tend to do what's right over what I'm told to do, and that probably made me unattractive to them. I would also say that during my time in the military as a enlisted man, as a combat medic, I was pretty underutilized towards what I could actually achieve. And the government is not the best at recognizing the resources it has available to it.
True. Okay. What about do you know of one person that I've interviewed called Paul Laviolette, and he's an astrophysicist, and his theories.
I am not familiar with them.
Okay.
I do need to go back and watch all your interviews, but I have a feeling that would take a minute.
Yeah, no, I know I have thousands, so but I can pinpoint certain people and interviews, and he'd probably be a good one as well because he has a theory um, that he thinks big, and he is. There are some people that have called him the Einstein of our time, which is not necessarily a compliment
Not
anymore. But if
really, no.
but if you want to sort of put it in, sort of a context, that's not what he calls himself, of course. And he is dealing with things like a galactic superwave that's headed our way from the galactic center and certain things that are happening here as a result of that. And I haven't interviewed him lately, so I don't know where his head is at, but he's written a number of books, and certainly they contain a lot of this kind of information. And anyway, it's just a different angle. But when you're building craft and you figure out where you want to go, right? Then these things come into consideration. Are you familiar with John Leonard Walson and his photographs of these gigantic craft near the sun, for example?
I have looked into his photographs, and I've also seen I've done quite a bit of looking for things like the Helen Cutter and the LeMay and the other USS ships. And I do think there are some legitimate photographs out there that have captured them against backdrops of different planets or moons. And it makes perfect sense to me that we would have something akin to Solar Warden. And
Yes.
I don't know if we're going beyond our solar system yet, but I'll say technological advancement is exponential, and wherever if I can do these things now using really very basic means, I think again our government could have been doing this in the early 1900s. And if not the early 1900s, at a minimum by the 1950s, 1960s, especially post Roswell, they were definitely doing these things. So that tells me we should, at very minimum, be an interstellar species by now, if not intergalactic.
Right. Okay. So, are you familiar with neutron powering spaceships with using neutron stars?
Yes, so the Pilsner rockets are something that David Adair speaks about that he was working on back in the 1960s, and it's effectively it was using a nuclear rocket to create a contained explosion, and it's very similar to a neutron star, and I expect that would be the natural evolution, is using something like a Dyson sphere around a already existing star, and neutron being more practical because of the small size. If you were able to overcome the material science requirements of getting something to maintain its form and grasp that neutron star, so that makes perfect sense to me, and I wouldn't be overly shocked if we already achieved something of that nature.
Right. Well, according to, I have a witness called Captain Mark Richards, who I've interviewed 12 times, who talks about this and what we can do to some degree. Also, in terms of weaponry, it gets into that. And he said specifically that the ETs do not like the fact that we had discovered this technology and can actually go out into the solar system to the vicinity of neutron stars and capture it somehow.
And I think that's probably a very reasonable assessment on their part, not to be too happy with us when you start considering the technological innovations required to make it to another solar system or another galaxy. By the time you achieve that, you've also achieved the technological requirements necessary to make weaponry which could destroy another solar system or another galaxy. And humans don't have the best reputation or the best historical precedent of being nonviolent in that way. So I think we could certainly be a little bit of a bumbling mess when it comes to our place in the galaxy. I kind of think of us as and I mean no offense to anybody if you live in a trailer, but this is kind of like you're driving down the highway and you look off the side and there's a trailer with like 13 kids running around outside and they're all fighting each other and everything. You just don't want to pull over there. You just keep driving, and that's kind of what I feel like humanity is probably perceived as to much of the rest of life forms that would be out there, because we're pretty reckless.
Okay, I have a different point of view of that, but we'll kind of let that lay for the moment. So when you're looking at all of this, and there are certain players along the line, who were very instrumental. Are you familiar with them? And let me also ask you another question that's related. If you're familiar with the books that have been written by Sean David Morton that were based on actually truth.
So I'm not familiar, and it's not that I don't research these things. I will generally take it in one ear and out the other, or take it with a grain of salt. I do live by a Socratic principle that true wisdom comes from knowing that I know nothing. So as much research as I can go out and do, as far as what people have blown the whistle on or stated or claimed, none of that's necessarily going to equate to proof for me unless I know that for myself. So I take it all very lightly, simply because I'm a skeptic at heart, and I prefer to find out instead of follow.
Sure. No problem. But there you can gain some insights, in my opinion,
Yep.
into the development of our secret space program, especially by reading his books, which is they're called the Sands of Time series. And arguably, he has been thrown in jail, thrown in prison for 4 years, and tortured and so on over that material that he was given by the lawyer of a person who claimed to be running or in charge of the secret space program in the early years, who, it is said, has time traveled out of here rather than died. So before he died, he authorized his lawyer to give this stuff to Sean. And I know Sean very well, and he's struggling right now with cancer. But anyway, there is also, I'm just curious, are there any particular scientists who their work resonates with you, or are there a particular, red flags where you follow what is they have been, like Fred Bell, for example, Fred Bell?
So I primarily, as far as secret space program, I keep eyes on Salvatore Pais or anything that has his name attached to it. I suspect very strongly that Salvatore Pais and the image of Salvatore Pais that we see are not the actual person, so much as these are releases that are coming out probably 50, 60 years after the fact of the actual design. But nonetheless, if it has that name on it, it is probably a controlled release or a limited hangout from the military.
Okay, are there any others?
So I don't specifically follow any scientists. I more so follow the science.
Okay. Okay, well, I was just trying to okay, well, because there's a whole nother side to this that is really fascinating. That has a lot to do with time travel and people that are alive now that were alive, maybe came over from, are you familiar? Did you ever see the television series called Fringe?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so you're familiar with the idea that there could be a parallel Earth, and that some of the scientists and even, people that we see now, even if they were dying in our area, in our part of this earth, that they could go to parallel earth and cross over and get them and bring them over here. Because I have actually a witness to this, and I wondered if you considered that.
Yeah, I definitely think that the multiversal string theory is real and applicable. I've witnessed things myself. Well, this won't sound flattering, but I'll say it anyway. So, uh, under the influence of THC or psilocybin, I experienced things that I would attribute to the skipping of timelines or along the Mandela effect. That I think are very real. I think that experience or that feeling of going from one timeline to another was absolutely real. So I also would support those theories. And I would also look to things like Ruth Bader Ginsburg or Joe Biden or other politicians who somehow have lived extraordinary long lives despite extraordinarily bad health. Now, what we can attribute that to, whether it's, buying organs in China or whether it's, mass or whether it's pulling them from another universe, there's certainly something there. And if we had that capability, would we do it? Absolutely.
Right. Okay. So, um, what about? I know this might be a slight departure, and then we can come back. But it's been bothering me that I want to ask you this.
Sure.
So, do you have any past life recall? Because do you happen to know? You sound like someone who might even know who you were in the prior life, and so on and so forth, and you may be even involved in World War II or as a scientist in the past or any of that stuff.
I do have past life recall, post head injury, and it didn't happen until I was reading a Newton translation of the Emerald Tablets, and I felt as if I had written them. Um, it was as if it was intrinsically the things that were already going through my mind. And there are certain things I've been able to observe from the Rashat structure that's effectively the remains of Atlantis to different Egyptian artifacts where I feel that I intrinsically am familiar with them in ways that I can't naturally explain beyond it being some form of a soul or a shared life between my soul currently and a soul that existed in the past. I was actually watching a very interesting scientific position on this last night about electrons, and that our electrons are all exactly the same, scientifically measured to be exactly the same weight, size, ratio, speed, everything. And there's the potential theory that every electron in the universe is effectively the exact same electron that is traveling forward and backward through time infinitely. So that would mean we are all quite literally the same electricity, just in a different time and place. And I think that the combined or universal consciousness of our souls being a part of that universe, a part of God, a part of consciousness, which are all one and the same, that our souls are channeled through our biological physical structure of our brain. And changes to that biological physical structure of our brain can change the soul that you are effectively channeling. So with me, with my head injury, I think the neuroplasticity perhaps opened doorways or gateways that I gained insight into where my soul had possibly been in other times. And I also think there's scientific proof of this that would support it. Things like Phineas Gage in the late 1800s, who took a railroad spike to the frontal lobe and changed his personality entirely, or the way that lobotomies actually function and work, or twins growing up opposite sides of the planet that it grow up to have effectively the same careers, the same lives, marry a spouse with the same name, or you have reincarnation accounts, or you also have people going into comas and waking up speaking languages they've never learned. So I think there's a lot of evidence to support both the past life existence, and that is actually in connection to a soul that is external to the body being channeled through the physical, biological structure of the mind.
Okay. All right. So now what I'd like to do is, I don't know how long we've been going, really. I don't want to keep you too long, but are there any areas that you want to discuss in relation to the secret space program that we haven't gone down those roads and you would like to?
Well, I think the most interesting kind of apex of where we're at right now is that we have things like Space Force coming to the forefront, and we also have SpaceX and Blue Origin and dozens of other private space companies, not just in the US, but globally, that are starting to push towards space-based industrialization, as am I with my own company. So as we push towards this space-based industrialization and space-based, human environments, we are going to naturally see things, and we're going to naturally need some form of disclosure. And I think that's why we started to see that disclosure throughout Congress, and we started to see the whistleblowers that somehow don't die and yet have very, very good knowledge and stories to tell. I think these are all limited hangouts. And these limited hangouts are leading towards a point where within the next 100 years, hopefully far less, mankind and humanity will become more aware that the secret space program is really just another branch of our military that we have always had, or at least at a minimum since the 60s. And I think that's almost a given at this point. And really, it comes down to, like all things, power and money and control. Now, I'll say that I do look at things through a spiritual lens as well. And I've, of course, mentioned God a couple times already, but the way that our money works for humanity, the way that our human race is structured, money is the fractionalization of God. It is basically, if you were to say, the tokenization of your labor, of resources, of human ideation or thought. And all of those things are translated into money, and they who control more money control more of what is effectively our reality based on the combined consciousness of God. So that thirst or greed for money is what the cabal uses to control and to damage and to hurt us and to do all the terrible things we know that they do. But what we need from the patriots and from the anons and from the people who are trying to fight back and do the right thing for humanity, you need to get money. You need to get more financial means so that you can affect change in a meaningful way, because money is power and power is the ability to do. So that is part of why I have pursued my companies, so that I can influence the economic system. And I've created an entirely enclosed economic system that could replace the current one, given enough growth and development. But what we're able to do once we actually have those funds is to bring these things to light, to bring inventions to reality by creating things like the inventions that I put out in our last interview. That's how we're going to make a meaningful impact and a change on where we are as a species, and hopefully eventually ascend into a higher level of consciousness.
Okay. And that's an interesting sort of approach. Now, in terms of, I'm kind of looking at the chat because we have a lot of people. I think that they're very interested, but I don't know if you want to take any questions from the chat, because I just want to give them the opportunity if they want. So if you want to frame a question, please put a question mark at the end of the question so I can look at the chat and see them quickly. But you're welcome to do so. Anyway, just opening up to the chat while we're waiting for anyone to come along with some questions. What in terms of our history, because have you looked into, because recently I did a presentation in Florida and I've been looking back because I was very concerned with the UAP hearing, and some of the things that Grush said that clearly indicate that they want to whitewash or even disappear. A lot of the incredible hard work and lives even that were lost to reveal, of whistleblowers going back, I go back 20 years, but that's nothing compared to, you're talking about 70 to 90 years, arguably, of secrecy that have been revealed all along by people like Phil Schneider and other people that have lost their lives doing so. And so I don't want to sit still while that whitewashing and disappearance goes on. So one of the things I did was bring up The Day After Roswell, which is a book by Philip Corso, as you may remember. And he actually, that's his job. His job was to bring secret space crash retrieval technology from the others into the commercial sector. I don't know how familiar you are with that, but he was doing that back in the 60s. And I mean the early 60s, like 60 or 61. And he was assigned that as a military role, right? So what we're talking about is Grush was saying, oh, this is the first time that crash retrievals have, been talked about or whatever. And that was such a, lie. And I guess he was instructed to say things like that in his testimony, but it was very concerning to me. So this is where I wonder if you have looked, over the history. You seem to know that that exists, that what we're talking about has a history, that it, but you don't know Tompkins. He was one of the architects, arguably, in the secret space program, even of how we really went to the moon, that had nothing to do with these little tin can things that they talk about, and so on and so forth. In other words, there are unsung heroes, I guess you might say, going all through, even though the program itself was feeding off of, human life and slavery and certainly money. A lot of our, if you know Catherine Austin Fitts, that a lot of the funding for the secret space program actually has gone from the private sector, from the population, into the secret space program in various nefarious ways and all of that. So there's a whole structure there. And there's also a fallacy that we are not as developed as we appear to be, that we, oh, how bad our not space program, but our military is, when with technology and their ships are falling apart and all these kind of, misdirects, right? And I actually worked for a company, I think it was a division of Boeing, that went black, as we call it, right? And I was there when it went black. I hadn't started doing what I do now at that time. So I was assistant to the head guy, and they disappeared in like the span of like 1 or 2 weeks, which in the aerospace industry, if you know how slow they move, ostensibly anyway, then that was just like crazy. Okay, what happened? So they just literally packed up and moved the whole division black and to another part of California. So I'm wondering if do you have that history under your belt, or have you, what do you think that you know about that?
Well, I would say I'm more educated as far as the government operations involving nefarious activities. I'm not as educated specifically within the secret space programs funding based on those activities, but I do know that things like Project Gladio, or things like the cocaine coming out of Colombia that is run by the Clinton Foundation.
Sure.
I do know that money is specifically being funneled through the CIA, and that the CIA money is likely, the black budget money is likely going to these FFRDCs. So these FFRDCs are where that elevates back up into a secret space program. And that's my understanding of the structure of the operation, is that all of the the drug money comes in, it is spent legitimately on low-level scientific innovation, things like cell phones and computers and things that consumers can buy. And that money is then pushed back into research grants, which is given to these FFRDCs that are producing technology that they are sending off into a specific sector of the military that is hidden from the public view.
Okay. Have you looked into, do you know who, I think it's Harry Reid, that particular, he's passed on supposedly now. And he worked with an entrepreneur. I forget his name. He's very well known. Robert, whatever. Anyway, they were involved also in the what do they call this place? I'm not going to remember. Anyway, there are certain trails that you can follow. Also, the fact that that Beck. Well, do you know Bechtel? Because Bechtel is actually a corporation where a lot of the secret space program gets funneled somehow. And we don't know how this money, gets changes hands and so on. I think a lot of it is off the books, like trillions of dollars, even more, billions, yearly. And so on. So there is a money trail, but following it is quite a challenge. It goes through what are called trading programs. Are you familiar with that?
Yep.
Okay. So within, in other words, if you are a person who's astute with money, then you might be following these various things having to do with how the money moves, right? BlackRock being, let's say, a big sort of front organization that contains this.
So the largest black hole of money on Earth, which I would say is probably a good place to start looking, is the Vatican Bank.
Sure.
The Vatican Bank, of course, is where the Italian mafia pushes through its money from Project Gladio, which is all of the drugs and arms and militia trafficking that has been going on for at least half a century. All of that money going into the Vatican Bank is basically unaccountable except to just the Pope and a few key cardinals at the top of that bank. And nobody actually knows what is in those accounts or how much or where it goes from there. So that is effectively the way that this is being sent into a black hole before it ever comes back out.
Okay, but well, I don't know if you are aware of this or would even agree with it, but the evidence that I have and that has been talked about in what we call the White Hat organization and white representatives within the White Hats is that they actually went into the Vatican underground vaults and took the gold and that they moved it elsewhere. This is an operation that the White Hats were involved with. Arguably, this guy, Charlie Ward, whose area of expertise is actually moving money like that, was involved supposedly in part of the reason why they hired him to start with. So I don't know, but what we're talking about is also, as I said, the trading program money that astronomically, doubles and triples and so on. You can't even get involved with for less than $1 million. It's run by the CIA, according to my sources, and so on. So we're really talking about, in a sense, if you want surface Earth, right? You've got surface Earth and you've got politics and you've got business and you've got this and that. But the actual, as far as I'm concerned, who's running the place is coming from underground. It's all going off planet. It's underground. A lot of it steers, places, even like to something as simple as South Africa, where they have runways where gold is taken off planet. Okay.
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
Yep. So I would say that the general population, as we know it, the people on the surface Earth, in their mind, we exist only as production assets for them to aggregate resources and send it to up the chain. Basically, we're their cattle, and we are there to be sheared when they need it or butchered if they want it. And that is the way that they treat us and the way that we have to look at it, if we're going to understand their mentality of how they operate.
Right. And that this political dog and pony show that people you spend their lives watching, getting all excited over is not really how the world is run.
Exactly. And I don't want to, I'm not here to pop people's bubbles about, if they're Trump fans or behind whatever politician. I really don't care. But that politician is not in control. The president is very far from the top of the food chain.
Right. Well, I have that scenario of special interest to me, and so it's very difficult to get close to that story. There's pieces that I know more about. For example, are you familiar with the saying "the right to issue" and the Basel, Switzerland families that are supposedly still in control of it? Are you familiar with that?
I'm not familiar with it. I have looked into documents such as the Philippines revaluation of currency back. This would have been in the early 2000s regarding GSAR and ISAR, in which it breaks down accounts throughout the world, numbering in the multi-trillions, sometimes quadrillions of dollars of value attributed to the different things. But in that, there's that family you're mentioning is mentioned, as well as many others that could have that same ability or that same power. I'm a little bit skeptical, only because if so many different entities or groups had that ability to issue to that level, I find it hard to see how we would not have more economic problems than we do. So I'm just I take it kind of with a grain of salt. I'm not sure if it's true or not.
Okay. Okay. Well, I have very high level financial advisors, so to speak, and who kind of know even hands on in certain hands on ways about this sort of thing, but whatever. So, well, I think it's a lot of fun to talk to you. I think you know more, but I'm not sure how to go about getting your information out here. And maybe you want to come back on the show and have a list of things that we didn't touch on that you could delve into, because and then also just in terms of the way you have crafted your own enterprises, let's say, to because I think that's a learning experience for a lot of people that are out there that are involved in free energy or things like that, have inventions, etc., but they always blow it when it comes to certain ways they do things, and then they get caught or thrown in jail or all those kinds of games that get played. So I think it's a good learning experience for people to hear from you, as a way to construct their approach that could keep them safer.
Yeah, and I really enjoy talking with you and talking with your audience. And of course, as I said before, there are things I can't say because of my military background. There are
All
things
right.
I love to say that I can't. And I try to do my best to dance around the topics as well as I can, while still giving you, your time's worth. Um, and really, I as much as I value all of the people you've interviewed over the years and thousands of interviews, and I know those are all probably exceptional people, I'm again a skeptic, so I try not to invest in things that I can't prove, or can't provide my own background for. But that said, I really hope that people got something out of this discussion, and I think that the visibility on how Epstein was used and how that type of corruption is used to maintain the secrecy of the secret space program is really what I wanted to get to today. So I'm glad we got to kind of dive into that.
Okay. Yeah, there's a trail. Definitely. Also, if you want to get into uranium one and all of that, we didn't really talk about rare earth minerals and all of that. That is the real reason we're over in Afghanistan, for example, and things like that, which all contribute, and Kazakhstan. I think it is that where there is a space city, and arguably, it's locked in by land. It has no oceans close to it, so it's considered to be a very safe place. So I think there's a huge secret space
So yeah,
wing there.
Kazakhstan is its very own rabbit hole for anyone that's never looked into it. Of course, if you've seen the movie Bruno, you think that it's all goats and carts and terribly developed, but that's definitely a misdirect. It's a very developed nation, and I think that Kazakhstan itself would be Khazaria, or the Khazarian mafia's capital.
Perhaps,
I
yeah, yeah.
suspect it's
At
probably,
least the ancient
yeah.
link up.
And
Yeah.
I suspect it's probably the Cabal's capital or the Council of 300's capital, or a mixture of all of them. And it's got a very outsized influence when you start to look at different layers of politics.
Right. Arguably, Israel's like the front organization, and Kazakhstan is the actual, meat and potatoes, if you will.
Exactly.
Yep. All right. Well, it's been great. I'm looking at the chat, and maybe it's just I can't figure out how to go. It's only gone to a certain level, and I'm looking for questions, and I guess I don't see any question marks. So I don't know why. But anyway, if there was question marks, sorry about that, guys. Maybe you could try a little harder next time. Um, well, somebody's asking a question, but in a sense, we're kind of addressing it in a roundabout way. I don't know if you have a direct answer, if you'd like to say one. The person is saying who's at the top of the food chain. It's like top of the pyramid kind of thing.
Um, I personally, I suspect it's a little bit more fluid and dynamic than people would think. I don't think there's any one individual at the top of the pyramid. I suspect it's a little bit more like Game of Thrones, where you've got, hundreds of different competing interests, and those competing interests are always in flux, even within the cabal. That it's very clear that they also infight very consistently, as we're seeing right now with the Democratic Party, and even though we said earlier that the politics are not the top level, your children are still going to fight each other if they're brother and sister, right? So there's going to be struggles all the way to the top, and I don't think any one entity is really in charge.
Okay. Now I found one more question, and then I'll let you go. It's kind of a big one, so you don't have to get too much detail. And I don't even know if you've gone down this road, but so have you investigated secret societies and the Black Sun, for example, or the Dragon families?
I have. I'm very much into investigating the esoterics, things going back to, of course, 11,600 years ago, which was the fall of Atlantis, the Younger Dryas period, meltwater pulse 1b 1 alpha, megafauna extinction, all a simultaneous event that wiped out the fourth age of man. And I suspect prior to that, we were a single global human civilization that was essentially reset after that catastrophe that would be called the Great Flood biblically. So most secret societies stem from that and from the Jacobian line, which would be the three sons of Noah. And I suspect that the Masons themselves, of course, being the biggest and most influential secret society that we publicly see, I suspect directly relates back to the Jacobian line and the pre-flood era or antediluvian era. Most secret societies, things like the Skull and Bones, which was Prescott Bush and Herbert Walker, George Walker, J.D. Vance, Ron DeSantis.
Yeah.
The Skull and Bones actually predates the Nazi Party, and the Skull and Bones on the SS officer's cap comes from that secret society in which Prescott Bush put that on there to kind of leave his stamp. So I think there's a very obvious ongoing influence from these societies. And I suspect it's that they had power or memory of what came before in the last age of man, and they've carried much of that power and influence forward. And they're simply looking to get humanity back to levels that it was at previously while still maintaining full control of all the outcomes. They're not looking to elevate the average person, they're looking to elevate themselves. And unfortunately, that's human nature.
Okay. Have you investigated Antarctica by that token? Because there's arguably a lot of the reason people are down there and that even Iran wants to get involved is the technology that comes from Atlantis that's buried under the ice.
Yes, I do suspect that Antarctica was unfrozen during the fourth age of man, and I also suspect that our precession or the tilt of the Earth changed from the cosmic impacts, which would be the Hiawatha, Greenland impact, as well as one in Aleppo and one in the Gulf of Mexico. Which basically means it was a shotgun blast. If I shoot at an apple 100 yards away with a buckshot, one piece might hit it. But if I shoot at it from 10 yards away, a few pieces will hit it. So that means since the Earth received multiple impacts in multiple trajectories, there was a near Earth object that exploded. And I find that very interesting since no one seems to be able to find Planet 10, even though the gravitational effects are still there. I think some of that esoterically would be easily explained by saying that there was a planet that was there that could have easily supported life, and it's no longer there because it exploded. And I think that explains the fall of the fourth age of man and why we had such a great flood.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to let you go now. And thank you for doing your best to answer the questions, and point in certain directions. And hopefully our audience gains something from this discussion. Like I said, I think it'd be great if you make a list or whatever you want to do, think about this going forward in a few weeks or months and come back to me with some things you might want to talk about that you didn't get a chance to address here.
Sure.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for being here, Patrick, and everyone. Thanks for watching.
Thank you, Carrie.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.